Welcome back to the IEA's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week, financing electricity access in Africa. Nearly 2 in 5 people still live without electricity in Africa. That's around 600 million people. In recent years, expanding access to electricity hasn't kept pace with population growth and progress has stalled. There is a pathway to universal access, but it comes with a price tag of $150 billion by 2035. For comparison, just $2.5 billion was committed to sub-Saharan Africa for electricity access in 2023. But although finance for electricity access remains scarce, there are solutions, whether by using funds more strategically, using tools to spur new investment, and channeling money to the communities that need it. And here to discuss some of these options from the IEA are energy and policy analysts Emma Gordon and Adam Ward. Okay, Emma Gordon and Adam Ward, thank you so much for joining me today. Now, I think it'd be useful to start with an overview of the situation in Africa with regards to electrification. So, Emma, could you just paint us a picture about how many people live with it, without it, and how it shapes people's lives as well?
Sure, Dan. So thanks very much for having us, firstly, to talk about this important topic. So today, globally, there are 730 million people that live without access to electricity, and 600 million of those are in Africa. So that means about 2 in every 5 people are living without access to electricity, and about 80% of those are in rural areas. And we see that progress on people gaining access to electricity has really slowed. It's barely been keeping pace with population growth. So last year, in 2024, we had less than 20 million people that gained access to electricity. In 2019, it was closer to 23 million people per year that were gaining access. And to those of us who have never had to question our access to electricity, I think sometimes it can be hard to conceptualize what it really means to live without access. And for example, I used to live in East Africa, and when you would visit some of these communities in the most sort of extreme cases, rural communities that really aren't densely populated, it really strikes you the breadth of what a lack of access means. It's not just within households with household lighting, phone charging, etc. It also has an impact on healthcare. Medical facilities don't have life-saving equipment that they might need. You can't refrigerate vaccines or drugs. It has a huge impact on social services, on education, on water sanitation, and of course on economic opportunities. And so really access to electricity, it can help improvements across a variety of tenets of people's lives.
Okay, well, let's just define our terms a little bit, because what does electricity access actually look like? So, Adam, maybe you could just explain what that means, the realities on the ground, the number of hours of electricity, and what it says in the report.
Thanks so much, Dan. The IEA defines electricity access across 3 bundles. So we have the basic bundle, the essential bundle, and the extended bundle. The basic bundle is, as it says, an extremely basic level of electricity. So we have more than one light providing task lighting. So when you need it, turn it on. When you don't need it, turn it off. Charging your phone and a radio. Once we move to the essential bundle, now we have 4 light bulbs providing light for 4 hours a day. We have a fan and we have a television for only 2 hours a day. The final bundle, the extended bundle, has all of the former, but now we're talking about a little bit more electricity consumption in the number of hours, plus we've added a refrigerator. How does this compare to consumption levels that we might see in the US or in Europe or Japan? What we're looking at for that basic bundle is only really 1 or 2% of the household consumption a year. So it's vastly less than what we are consuming in countries, as I said, like the US or Europe.
Okay, now the report says for the first time the IEA has tracked electricity financing commitments. So first of all, what is new about that and how does the tracking process work?
Sure. So tracking financing commitments is a very complicated and time-consuming process, as I'm sure you can imagine. But within the IEA, we have long been monitoring investment flows into the energy sector. But what we were not previously able to pull out was how much financing was specifically going to providing new connections to electricity. And so that number we know is very important for policymakers and for international public capital providers so that they can understand the trends, but also to identify gaps to, again, go forward, think how we can improve financing to really support universal access to electricity. So we've been tracking financial commitments from 2019 to 2023 from international public capital providers and from the private sector. Obviously, within that, we're tracking commitments towards mini-grids, solar home systems. We've also developed a methodology to establish how much investment going into on-grid power connections and grid networks is targeting new connections. And we've also been tracking what we call market support, so finance going into policy reforms, capacity building, technical assistance, etc.
Okay, and let's look at some of the results of what you found about some of the finance that you were tracking. And it showed that 2.5 billion a year was being directed to sub-Saharan Africa. Could you tell us a bit about that figure? Was that what you were expected? Is that enough to meet the needs of that region?
Yeah, great question. So I think the 2.5 billion figure, when we first put together the tracking, I think we were potentially surprised that it was as low as it is, or that it was only 2.5 billion. We know that this is a topic that's very important to a lot of the different financing providers. I think the reality is the COVID pandemic did have a significant impact on the flow of financing. So we did see a dip in 2020, which has taken several years to recover. So we have seen financing in 2023 is about a quarter higher than in 2019. So without that dip, we could expect the figure to be higher. I think a potential sign and cause for optimism is around Mission 300, which is a big initiative by the African Development Bank and the World Bank that was launched at the end of 2024 and 2025, which has seen a huge number of new commitments being put towards electricity access financing. And those aren't reflected in the data yet because we only track up to 2023. So I think we will see an increase in this number going forward.
Right. Now, there is a pathway in the reports to reach universal access. So could you tell us how much that's going to cost, how much it's going to cost per year? And there's a target of 2035 in there as well, isn't there?
Sure, yes. So within the report, we use a scenario that the IEA developed called the Accelerating Clean Cooking and Electricity Services scenario, so the ACCESS scenario. And this was a scenario that we developed originally for a clean cooking report. And what this scenario does is it charts a pathway to universal access based on historic progress and successes. And under this pathway, we see Africa achieve universal access to electricity by 2035. How that's achieved is about 45% of the population without access today are connected via the grid, and the rest are connected via decentralized solutions, mini-grids and solar home systems, particularly in areas where communities are already quite far from existing grids. And to make this scenario achievable, it requires investment of about $150 billion over the whole decade. So an annual average of about $15 billion. But what we see over the 10-year period is from the level of financing today, it more than triples between now and 2030, and then triples again between 2031 and 2035. So we do see a gradual increase, which is in line with this approach of charting progress based on historic success.
Now, thinking about where the money is coming from today, let's just talk about the difference between the public and the private sector. What makes up the majority right now?
Sure. So the majority of financing at the moment is coming from the public sector. So historically, only about 30% of the tracked commitments have come from the private sector. And the challenge for the private sector is that these projects are quite difficult. Many investors find that they don't have a risk return profile that suits their own sort of investment approach. So it tends to be these projects are much smaller than utility scale electricity generation projects. And from a risk perspective, they also have not just one off-taker. It's not just that you're selling power to the utility or a commercial and industrial user. It's really you have to assess the ability of a large group of consumers to pay back the investment on the project. There's also a very low initial demand on projects. So it takes a long time to recoup costs, and the profit margins tend to be quite small. So there's only a comparatively small pool of private capital that can invest in these projects. It tends to be impact investors, occasionally commercial banks, and indeed sort of angel networks of friends, family, etc.
I also just want to talk a bit about the way that the money has been spent in the past and that difference between spending money on grids and other solutions, other decentralized solutions. And I think, Adam, people might understand how you spend money on grids, but what are some of the other decentralized solutions that are being spoken about?
So we've looked at mini grids and solar home systems. So what are these? Mini grids are small decentralized solutions which are not connected to your main grid. Typically, these are powered by either solar or a small hydro or wind, and they can be backed up by either batteries or diesel generators. And they're connecting a small number of homes, maybe a few businesses as well. So those are mini grids. Even smaller than this are solar home systems. So these are individual solar panels that are on the roofs of houses, also potentially backed up by either a generator or a battery, and they're providing basic electricity services to homes or, in some cases, businesses. So whereas mini grids, I mentioned the bundles earlier, can provide all of the IEA bundles of electricity access, for solar home systems, we only see that they can provide either the basic or the essential bundle.
Now, the report also mentions how important concessional finance is. For starters, just remind us what that is.
Sure. So concessional finance, it's a bit of jargon, but it's a very useful term to be aware of. So essentially, concessional finance is finance that's provided at below market rate. So that might mean it's cheaper. It might mean it has a longer time frame, which is often something we describe as patient capital. And it means that the finance provider has a lower or in some cases no return expectation. And the other slightly jargony term that's useful to be aware of is catalytic capital, which is another way to describe some of this concessional finance. And a key objective of catalytic capital is that, of course, it catalyzes something else. And that can either mean that it's bringing in private finance in a blended finance structure, so a structure that involves both public and private finance in the same transaction, or it can mean it's supporting the creation of a new market. So potentially testing a new business model, testing a new technology in a country that might not previously have been using, etc.
And could you give us a sense of how much concessional finance will be needed?
Sure. So of the 150 billion over the 10 years, it's just over 60 billion of that will be concessional. And how that's split varies quite a lot. We see a significant investment of concessional capital in grid networks, partly because we know that the private sector will struggle to operate in that space until further reforms have been made to allow greater private investment, but also to support new market development for mini grids, solar home systems, and to support, for example, fragile and conflict-prone states, where, again, it's very challenging for the private sector to operate.
And I've just got another question about how you can ensure that certainly foreign money, foreign investment, is distributed in what feels like a fair or equitable way. Is there a problem that quite a lot of the investment gets taken up by a small number of countries, and perhaps it can't flow to some of those other more vulnerable places you mentioned?
We do see that the vast amount of money is going to a select group of countries. And what we want to see, of course, is that it's more evenly distributed. I think, firstly, development partners need to work with governments to support their capacity, to support their planning, that they are able then to support the development of these bankable projects that we say. Basically, that's a project that can come forward, that can be invested in. The challenge that you can see is that a group of countries that are able to have their planning in a robust way, they then can attract and crowd in their investment. But really what we want to see everyone lifted up. We want to see everyone gaining access to electricity, and to ensure that even distribution, as I said, robust planning, building the capacity of a number of countries that can then access that funding.
Now, I think it's worth us thinking about some of the geographical challenges, because in really simple terms, we're not going to have a one-size-fits-all approach. So, Adam, can you talk us through some of the price differences? And by that, I mean the affordability of electricity in different regions of Africa.
So in the report, what we did is we went city by city, town by town, village by village, and matched together the specific technology that those citizens would gain access via. So be it grids, be it mini grids, or be it solar home systems. And we brought together the tariff level that they would be facing. So that is the cost that they would have to pay at the end of the week or the end of the month, and then match that with their household income level. And the IEA defines affordability of electricity if it costs less than 5% of household income. So what do we see is that around 200 million people, 220 million people would find the basic bundle unaffordable for those that are gaining access. And this rises to 400 million for the essential bundle. Now let's think about those different technologies across the continent. For grids, broadly affordable. Over 94% of people that would gain access would find it affordable at that basic level of consumption. For mini grids now, it drops to just below 70%. And then for solar home systems, it's less than 10%. So why do we see this difference? It's to do with subsidies. So grids are typically subsidized, mini grids as well. We do see some subsidies. And then for solar home systems, we see a lack of subsidies, firstly, and secondly, it's the poorest households. This is the technology that they'll be gaining access via. Now, to examine some of those regional differences that you asked about, we split sub-Saharan Africa into Eastern, Central, Western, and Southern Africa. For the basic bundle, as I mentioned, grids, broadly affordable. The only dip we see is really in East and West Africa, but it's still over 90%. For mini grids in Southern Africa, affordability is close to 100%. For Western Africa, it's close to 80%. And then for Central and East, it's around 65%. So finally, for solar home systems, in Southern Africa, due to higher incomes and also slightly lower costs, we see affordability around 40%. However, this really drops off for the other regions. So for Western Africa, it's below 15%. And then for Central and Eastern, it is only 6%. So really what we're calling on is policies and finance to take a different geographical approach given the local circumstances.
And could you just tell us a bit more about how electricity can be provided to some of those vulnerable groups that you mentioned? What are some of the solutions that have worked in the past?
Definitely. So when we looked at the vulnerable groups, we looked at informal settlements, we looked at refugees, we also looked at small island developing states. So it's important to remember informal settlements, there's around 240 million people in Africa that are living in informal settlements. So these are typically very close to cities. So one would think, okay, we can provide them with a grid connection. However, that's often very difficult because it's an informal settlement. They're not officially residents within the city. They can't request the utility to come and make a grid connection. You also have problems of gangs operating in these informal settlements. So even if you get a legal connection, the gang may come along and cut it and create an illegal connection and make you pay them. For the informal settlements, the first thing that governments can do is, of course, they can incorporate them into the city. So we've seen that with great success in South Africa, in Langa Township, Kailicha Township that have been incorporated. And that's a first really important step. Then we can have the pay-go models, though that's where it's payment for a service that you use. That makes it a lot more affordable. For refugees, it is more challenging, of course. There are around 40 million refugees currently living in Africa, and we see that there are sometimes challenges with the local government in terms of the host country government, in terms of the camps. They don't want to view them as being permanent. Of course, these are refugees. They want the stability to return to their home country and that they can return. And there's a concern about providing the infrastructure that may encourage or support a longer-term establishment in the country. However, there's some really great examples with Mercy Corps, for example, in Ethiopia, in Shedder town, which has provided electricity access via a mini-grid, both to the local community and also the refugee camp. So what this means is hopefully when the refugee camp is reduced and those citizens are able to return home, the electricity then is still being provided to the local community. And indeed in other countries, such as in Jordan, we're seeing now that refugees are returning home given the fall of the Assad regime. And that electricity is being sold to the grid, and you have a viable legacy asset that benefits the host country.
Right, we've covered a lot of the financial solutions, but of course, there are other solutions that governments can offer as well. So what have governments done in the past that have worked? What does the report mention are some of the solutions that perhaps would help on the ground?
There's a number of things that governments can do and have been doing across Africa, which have led to successes in scaling up electricity access. So the first is being really clear about where the grid is going to provide access and where there will be decentralized solutions, be it mini-grids or solar home systems. This is important because if a mini-grid developer is going to come to a village and provide electricity access, they don't want to run the risk that maybe in a year or 2 years, the grid will suddenly arrive and take away their business. The second aspect that governments can do is on how they set those mini-grid tariffs. What we've seen in a number of countries is that they have unfortunately taken an approach to say, okay, there will be one national tariff. It doesn't matter if it's a grid or if it's a mini-grid. And in those instances, you have communities that are saying, we recognize that we're in a rural, hard-to-reach area. We currently don't have access to electricity, and we would be willing to pay a little bit more to gain that access. However, the governments have said no, that there is only one tariff. And unfortunately, those communities end up with no access to electricity. But where we've seen great successes is where there have been a dialogue between those communities, between local governments, and between the central government and the utility to set those tariffs. And indeed, there are a number of countries across Africa that have a clear framework and tools in place to clearly set those mini-grid tariffs so that everyone can see that they're done in a transparent way, everyone can see that they are fair and they are appropriate for the level of access that they want to do.
So just lastly, there is a pathway to universal access here, but there's obviously a fair distance to go. But perhaps you could both end by reasons for optimism, either by pointing to things that we've seen in the past or reasons to believe that the solutions are there.
So I think maybe it's important to take a bit of a step back and think about what the end goal here is, what the key objective is. It's not just about achieving universal electricity access. It's about overall supporting socioeconomic development. And the reason that I think it's important to frame it in this light is because it's not just thinking about, as we've mentioned, how people get a connection, it's how they afford to use it, how they increase their demand over time, and whether that provides economic opportunities, improvements to social services, etc. And when you think of it from that perspective, it's really about making sure that electricity access and things like rural development go hand in hand. And we have seen a lot of examples in the region of this combination of electricity access and development programs. On the policy side, for example, in Zambia, the presidency has an initiative specifically targeting demand stimulation in areas where mini-grids are being expanded. From the financial sector side, you see commercial banks in Ghana has some great examples, also Kenya, of where banks are creating financial tools to support households to purchase more appliances to increase their demand over time. And from development partners, again, lots of interesting programs, but one that strikes me is there's an initiative by Energizing Development in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, working with smallholder farmers to use sustainable energy to improve the productivity of their agricultural yields. And so when you look at it from that broader perspective, it might initially seem a bit more daunting and harder to achieve. But how I would prefer to look at it is that it means that we have technologies that we already know. We have solutions that we already know. And there's this great opportunity to use those to have a huge impact on people's lives. And I remain personally optimistic that that's possible, but I also believe that the access scenario, the pathway that we've laid out within this report demonstrates that that is also possible.
From my personal experience, after I lived and worked in Ethiopia, I then went to work in Southeast Asia and worked with Vietnam and Cambodia. And you only need to look at those two countries and see Vietnam's rural access to electricity was around 10% in the 1990s. You know, it skyrocketed to around 70% by 2009, and now essentially 100% electricity access. Cambodia is the same. In 2010, it was 23%. By 2019, it was 89%. And exactly as Emma said, this access to electricity, it provides economic development. It enables these rural communities to suddenly get cold storage. There's a great example in Nigeria from All On, which is an impact investor, how they provided investment to a Nigerian chicken farmer who suddenly has cold storage now, so they can expand their business, they can expand markets. And this is exactly what we saw all across Southeast Asia, allowing the citizens, allowing the businesses to move up the value chain, to gain higher income earning, increase their economic development. And there is absolutely no reason why the same will not and should not happen in Africa. And we're not talking about just the basic level of electricity consumption. We've mentioned those bundles, but really what we want to see is, okay, make that first leap for basic, make it affordable for citizens. But if you are going to introduce measures such as subsidies, these need to be time-bound, they need to be targeted, because you will see economic development, you will see increased prosperity. They can be removed, and then this will benefit the whole country and ultimately the whole continent as well.
Okay, Emma Gordon and Adam Ward, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having us on.